He thought he had lost everything, until he saw her leaving the hospital with 3 babies in her arms, and his heart was never the same. If you like stories like this, be sure to subscribe to this channel. We post every day. Continuing. The biting July wind lashed against the windows of the 35th floor, but Richard Oliver Montgomery didn't even lift his eyes from the contracts spread across the mahogany table. At 38, he had built an empire that defied gravity, skyscrapers piercing the London sky, residential complexes redefining the concept of luxury, and a name that made international investors cross oceans just for a 15-minute meeting. His desk was strategically positioned facing the urban landscape he had helped shape. Every glass and steel structure shimmering under the afternoon sun bore his signature, his Midas touch transforming abandoned plots into billionaire fortunes. Success had become his second skin, as natural as breathing. The intercom whispered his secretary's controlled voice. "Mr. Montgomery, the meeting with the Singapore investors has been confirmed for 5 p.m., and your wife called again." Richard paused for a fraction of a second, his Mont Blanc pen suspended over the paper. Isabel had called 3 times that week, always at the same time, always with the same urgency, contained in a voice he chose to ignore. Work was work, and at that moment he was closing a deal that would put another $200 million into his account. "Tell her I'll call back after the meeting," he replied, already knowing he wouldn't. Isabel Carter Montgomery was at that exact moment 40 minutes away, at St. Thomas's Hospital, where she had worked as an obstetric nurse for almost a decade. Her delicate hands, which Richard had once compared to porcelain, now trembled slightly as she held the blood test result. 11 weeks. The baby was 11 weeks old, and she still hadn't managed to share the news with her husband. For 5 years of marriage, they had built a life that looked perfect from the outside. Richard provided everything money could buy: the penthouse apartment in Belgravia, trips to Paris and New York, the jewelry she rarely wore. Isabel, in turn, tried to transform that cold, minimalist space into a home. She placed plants in strategic corners, scattered photographs on the furniture, cooked dinners that often grew cold alone on the table. She was his opposite in everything. Where Richard saw numbers, she saw people. Where he built walls, she built bridges. At the hospital, she was known for her ability to calm the most nervous, expectant mothers, for holding trembling hands during difficult births, for transforming moments of pain into celebrations of life. It was this same tenderness that she tried, unsuccessfully, to awaken in Richard. Attempts to discuss children always hit the same wall. He would change the subject, claim it wasn't the right time yet, that the company was expanding, that the next 2 years would be crucial. Isabel understood non-verbal language better than anyone. After all, she spent her days deciphering the looks of women in labor, and Richard's eyes, when she mentioned babies, closed like vaults. That night, when Richard finally arrived home at 11:40, he found Isabel on the balcony, wrapped in a cotton robe, looking at the city lights that spread out like terrestrial stars. She held a cup of chamomile tea. She had given up coffee a few weeks ago, though Richard hadn't noticed. "How was the meeting?" she asked, without turning around. "We closed Singapore. It will be the largest residential project in Southeast Asia." His voice carried the fatigue of someone who had spent 4 hours negotiating in English, but also the satisfaction of another achievement. Isabel nodded, still with her back to him. "Richard, I need to tell you something." Something in her tone made him pause in the middle of loosening his tie. It was a tone she used at the hospital when she needed to deliver delicate news to family members. "I'm pregnant." The 2 words suspended time between them. Richard felt as if the 35th floor had dissolved beneath his feet. Pregnant. Isabel was pregnant, and suddenly all his meticulously organized plans for the next 5 years seemed scribbled in pencil on wet paper. "How long have you known?" The question came out colder than he intended. 3 weeks. Isabel finally turned, and he could see her eyes were moist. "I tried to tell you before, but you were always working, I know." Richard ran a hand through his hair, disarranging his impeccable hairstyle. "We need to talk about this calmly. Tomorrow, perhaps." Tomorrow you have that trip to Manchester. On Monday, then. And the meeting with the Koreans. Isabel, you know how busy my schedule is. It was at that moment that something broke inside her. It wasn't a dramatic explosion, but something silent and definitive, like a thread snapping at the bottom of the ocean. She had dreamed of this moment for years, imagined what it would be like to share the joy of pregnancy with the man she loved. In her fantasies, he would pick her up, spin her around the room, plan the baby's room, choose names together. The reality was, Richard mentally calculating how to fit a conversation about fatherhood between business meetings. "All right," she said, and her voice came out strangely serene. "We'll talk when it's convenient for you." Richard didn't catch the irony, or pretended not to. He kissed her forehead and mumbled something about taking a shower and reviewing some contracts. Isabel stayed on the balcony until almost 2 in the morning, one hand instinctively protecting her still flat belly, looking at the city that never slept, and feeling more alone than she ever had in her life. The following days dragged on in an awkward dance of mutual avoidance. Richard plunged even deeper into work, arriving home when Isabel was already asleep and leaving before she woke up. He left notes on the fridge. "Trip to Edinburgh, back Thursday, or late meeting, don't wait for me for dinner," as if she were just another employee receiving instructions. Isabel, in turn, began to make silent plans. She mentally calculated her savings, researched smaller, cozier apartments in neighborhoods where she could raise a child without the child feeling lost in marble corridors. At work, she observed the families forming around her. Fathers crying with emotion as they held their newborns, mothers radiating happiness even after exhausting births, grandparents vying to hold the baby first. She wanted that. She wanted to be a real family, not just 2 people sharing an address and a bank account. The final conversation happened on a rainy Thursday in August. Richard had cancelled another trip and arrived home early, determined to resolve the situation. He found Isabel in the kitchen, preparing a pumpkin soup that filled the house with a homemade aroma that contrasted brutally with the coldness of the designer furniture. "About the baby," he began, as if opening a business meeting. "I think we need to be practical." Isabel turned off the stove and faced him. She was wearing a simple blue cotton dress, her hair tied in a messy bun, and Richard felt a pang of something he couldn't identify. Perhaps longing for the woman she was when they met, when his career was still under construction and they dreamed together. "Practical," she repeated. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means that maybe it's not the ideal time yet. The company is in a crucial phase. We have that project in New York that will demand my full attention for the next 2 years. And you love your work at the hospital. It would be a shame to interrupt now." Isabel studied him for a long moment, as if seeing a stranger wearing the face of the man she had married. "Are you suggesting I abort our child?" "I'm suggesting that maybe we should wait a little longer. That's all." "Wait until when, Richard? Until you feel ready? Until the company no longer needs you 24 hours a day? Until you discover there's life beyond spreadsheets and contracts?" Her voice was rising, but it wasn't anger that showed through. It was a deep sadness, a disillusionment that had been accumulating for months. "No need to dramatize, Issa. I'm just being realistic." "Realistic?" She laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "You know what's realistic, Richard. It's that I'm going to have this baby, with or without you. It's that I'm going to love this child, care for them, give them everything they need to grow up happy, and you can choose to be a part of it or not." Richard felt control of the situation, slipping through his fingers like sand. He was used to negotiations where both parties eventually reached a mutually beneficial agreement. But Isabel wasn't negotiating, she was making a statement. "You can't make that decision alone," he said, and immediately regretted the words. "Yes, I can, and I am." Isabel took off her apron and hung it on the hook with deliberately calm movements. "I'm leaving, Richard. Today." "Don't be ridiculous. Where are you going?" "Away from you." The simplicity of the answer hit him like a punch. Isabel went upstairs, and he could hear her opening and closing drawers, the sound of her suitcase being dragged across the wooden floor. When she came down 20 minutes later, she carried only a small bag and her hospital purse. "Isabel, let's talk like adults. I tried to talk for weeks, but you were too busy being successful." She stopped at the door, one hand on the golden doorknob. "When you decide what's really important in your life, call me, but don't expect me to be here when that happens." And then she was gone. Richard stood in the entrance hall for almost an hour, waiting for her to come back, for the whole scene to be just a dramatization to get his attention. When he finally accepted that she wouldn't return, his first reaction was anger. How dared she create a scene like that? How dared she emotionally blackmail him? But as the days passed and the apartment remained empty, anger gave way to something more complex. He tried to convince himself that he was better off without distractions, that now he could focus completely on work. He hired a design company to redo the entire decor, erasing any trace of Isabel's presence. Out went the plants she cultivated so carefully. Out went the smiling photographs. Out went the colorful cushions she had scattered on the leather sofas. The apartment became even more minimalist, even colder, even more perfect to be photographed in architecture magazines. Richard plunged into work with an intensity that impressed even his partners. He expanded abroad aggressively, closed deals on 3 continents, multiplied the company's assets. On the outside, he remained the business titan. Inside, he spent sleepless nights wondering if Isabel was well, if the pregnancy was progressing normally, if she needed anything. But he never called. His pride was greater than his curiosity, and his ability to rationalize his own feelings was almost infinite. He convinced himself that he had made the right choice, that fatherhood would have ruined his career, that Isabel had been selfish in forcing a situation he was not prepared to face. It was easier to believe that than to admit he had made the biggest mistake of his life. Weeks turned into months, and Richard built skyscrapers while Isabel built a new life. She had moved into a small but cozy apartment in Clapham, near the hospital where she worked. She painted the walls soft colors, set up a corner for the baby with simple but loving furniture. She worked until her 6th month of pregnancy, until her obstetrician insisted she slow down. She had the support of her colleagues at the hospital, who surrounded her with care and affection. But in the early hours when the baby kicked too hard to let her sleep, Isabel found herself looking at the phone, imagining what it would be like if Richard were there, feeling the kicks, talking to the child growing inside her. She didn't know that across town Richard also spent sleepless nights. She didn't know that he had saved her number in his phone with the name Home, and that sometimes he would hover his finger over the dial button, not daring to press it. She didn't know that he had subscribed to websites about pregnancy and fetal development, trying to calculate how many weeks pregnant she would be, if the baby already had hair, if it could already hear external sounds. They were a couple loving each other from a distance, each protected by walls of pride that seemed insurmountable. Richard's collapse began on a sunny Saturday morning at the luxury resort in the Lake District, where he was closing a deal that would add another 0 to his net worth. He was sitting at a glass table overlooking the mountains, surrounded by international investors, discussing the construction of a tourist complex that would be the largest in the Southern Hemisphere. The Dom Perignon champagne glasses reflected the mountain sun, and figures flew through the conversation like confetti at a billionaire party. His cell phone rang once. He ignored it. It rang again. He hung up. On the 3rd call, he thought it might be business-related and answered with irritation. "Hello? Mr. Montgomery? This is Dr. Charles Dawson from St. Thomas's Hospital. Are you Isabel Carter Montgomery's husband?" The world stopped. The voices around the table turned into background noise. The mountains lost focus. The champagne tasted flat in his mouth. "I am. What happened?" "Your wife is in premature labor, sir. Triplets. She's only 32 weeks pregnant, and the birth is complicated. There's significant hemorrhage and, well, you should come immediately." Triplets. The word echoed in Richard's mind like a broken bell. It wasn't one baby. It was 3. 3 tiny lives fighting to be born into the world, and he was 200 miles away, toasting business deals while the woman he loved bled on an operating table. "I'm coming," he managed to say and hung up the phone. The investors looked at him with curiosity. Someone made a joke about wives calling at the wrong time. Richard stood up, left the billion-dollar figures behind and simply said, "The deal is off." He had never run so fast in his life. The helicopter cut through the air with an urgency that reflected Richard's despair. He had rented the fastest aircraft available, offering double the normal price for the pilot to fly at the limit of safe speed. During the 40-minute flight, Richard wrestled between panic and a guilt that consumed him like acid. Triplets. How had Isabel carried 3 babies alone for all those months? How had she faced the anxiety, the appointments, the worries without anyone to share the burden? St. Thomas's Hospital appeared on the horizon like an island of hope and terror. Richard leaped from the helicopter before the propellers even stopped completely, running through the corridors with his crumpled suit and pounding heart. At the reception, he shouted Isabel's name as if it were a password that could open all doors. "Mr. Montgomery?" A nurse approached, recognizing the description she had received from the doctor. "Please follow me." The hospital corridors stretched infinitely ahead, smelling of disinfectant and reverberating with the sounds of life, in constant motion. Richard followed the nurse like a man in a trance, trying to process the reality that somewhere in that labyrinth of white tiles, Isabel was fighting for her life while giving birth to 3 children he didn't even know existed. "How is she?" he asked, and his voice sounded hoarse even to himself. "Dr. Dawson will explain everything. But I need to prepare you. It was a very complicated delivery. Your wife lost a lot of blood, and the babies were born prematurely. They are all in the neonatal intensive care unit, neonatal ICU." The words hit Richard like stones. He had grown up believing that money could solve any problem, that sufficient success, money, and proper planning could control any variable. But there, in that sterile corridor, he discovered that there are territories where fortunes are worthless, places where the only currency that matters are seconds, heartbeats, and the mysterious force that keeps life pulsating. Dr. Dawson was a man in his 50s, with kind but tired eyes, someone who had spent his entire life navigating between miracles and tragedies. He found Richard in the waiting room and led him to a small office full of diplomas on the walls and photos of babies he had helped bring into the world. "Mr. Montgomery, I need to be direct. Your wife suffered a severe postpartum hemorrhage. We managed to control it, but she lost a lot of blood and is sedated in the ICU. Her condition is stable, but we are still monitoring." Richard felt his legs weaken. "And the babies?" 3 boys. They were born at 32 weeks, which is considered moderately premature. They are intubated in the neonatal ICU, but their vital signs are encouraging. The smallest weighed 1 kilo 200 grams, the largest 1 kilo 400 grams, 1 kilo 200 grams. Richard tried to visualize how much that represented, but his mind refused to process that human beings could be so small and still be alive, breathing, fighting. "Can I see them?" "First, you need to be properly gowned." "And Mr. Montgomery—" The doctor paused, studying the distraught face of the man in front of him. "Your wife mentioned several times that you are separated. She didn't expect you to come." The statement fell like a hammer on Richard's conscience. Isabel had faced a triplet pregnancy alone, had suffered a dangerous premature birth without anyone's hand to hold, and yet he was the emergency contact. He was the father she had preserved in the hospital documents, even after he had rejected fatherhood. "I was wrong," Richard murmured, more to himself than to the doctor. "I was completely wrong." Dr. Dawson guided him through a ritual that would be repeated hundreds of times in the coming months. Washing hands for 2 full minutes, putting on the sterile gown, putting on disposable shoe covers, disinfecting hands again. Each step was a preparation not only physical but emotional to enter a world where the fragility of life revealed itself in its purest form. The neonatal ICU was a universe apart. Machines beeped at constant rhythms, soft lights created an almost ethereal atmosphere, and nurses moved with the precision of dancers between incubators that looked like space capsules. Richard was led to 3 incubators aligned side by side, each containing a human being so small that it fit in the palm of a hand. The first baby was on the right. Wires and tubes seemed to cover more space on his body than his skin itself, which had a translucent pinkish color. His eyes were closed, but his chest rose and fell in a mechanical rhythm assisted by machines. A tiny bracelet identified Montgomery Baby A. The second was in the middle, slightly larger than the first, but still frighteningly fragile. His fingers were the size of matchsticks, and Richard could see the bluish veins under his thin skin. Montgomery Baby B. The third, on the left, seemed slightly stronger. His limbs moved occasionally, and even intubated, there was something in his posture that suggested determination. Montgomery Baby C. Richard pressed his forehead against the glass of the first incubator and began to cry. They were not controlled or dignified tears. It was a primitive, desperate cry, from a man who had just discovered what really matters in life. There were 3 pieces of his heart beating outside his body, 3 lives that depended completely on machines to breathe, and he had almost lost the chance to know them by counting money. "They are your sons," said the head nurse, a mature woman with hands calloused from caring for premature babies. "And they are fighters, 3 little warriors. Can I touch them?" "You can, but very carefully, just 1 finger and very gently." Richard opened the side opening of the middle incubator and extended his index finger to delicately touch Baby B's tiny hand. The boy's fingers, thinner than toothpicks, instinctively closed around his father's finger. It was an automatic reflex, but for Richard it was like receiving absolution. That microscopic squeeze contained more forgiveness than he deserved. "I'm sorry," he whispered to his 3 sons. "I'm sorry I wasn't here. I'm sorry I was a coward. But I'm here now, and I'm not leaving." He spent the next 2 hours there memorizing every detail of the boys' faces, trying to identify his or Isabel's features in their still-forming countenances. Baby A had a squarer chin like his. Baby B seemed to have inherited Isabel's eye shape. Baby C had long fingers, which could have come from either of them. When he was finally taken to see Isabel in the adult ICU, Richard had to lean against the wall to keep from collapsing. She was as pale as paper, with tubes running down her throat and wires connected to monitors that drew green waves on the screen. Her brown hair was spread across the white pillow, framing a face that seemed to have aged years in a matter of hours. Richard pulled a chair close to the bed and held her hand, which was cold and slightly swollen from the IVs. He began to speak, even knowing she probably couldn't hear him. "Issa, I'm an idiot. A complete idiot. You were carrying 3 babies, and I didn't even ask how you were feeling. You were building a family alone while I was building empty buildings." His voice faltered, but he continued. "I saw our sons. They are beautiful. They are perfect. They are strong like you, and I'm going to be here for, and I'm, all of you, I promise. No matter how long it takes, no matter what I have to sacrifice, I will be here." He spent the whole night by her bedside, holding her hand and making silent promises. He refused offers of coffee, food, or a more comfortable place to rest. When his secretary called asking about meetings scheduled for Monday, Richard hung up the phone and put it on silent mode. The next morning, Isabel began to move slightly. Her fingers twitched in Richard's hand. Her eyes moved under closed eyelids. The process of waking up was gradual, like someone emerging from a very deep dream. When her eyes finally opened and met his, the expression that crossed her face was too complex to decipher. Surprise, relief, confusion, and something that might have been anger mixed in a look Richard would never forget. She tried to speak, but the tube in her throat prevented her. Richard called the nurse, who explained that they would have to wait a few more hours before removing the intubation until they were sure she could breathe adequately on her own. "The babies are fine," Richard said, anticipating the question he saw in her eyes. 3 boys. They are small but strong, very strong." Tears rolled down Isabel's temples. Richard gently wiped them away with the back of his hand, and for the first time in months, she didn't pull away from his touch. When the tube was finally removed, Isabel's first words were, "Why are you here?" The question was fair, but it still cut deep. Richard had spent hours mentally rehearsing what he would say when she woke up, but all the carefully chosen words disappeared. Because I'm an idiot who almost lost the most important thing in life, he replied with brutal honesty. And because these are my sons too, and I want to know them. I want to take care of them. I want to take care of you. Isabel studied him for a long moment. There was much to process. His presence there, the fact that there had been 3 babies and not 1, the reality that she had survived a delivery that could have been fatal, the awareness that she would be the mother of premature triplets. "Where were you when I needed you?" she asked, and there was no accusation in her voice, only a deep sadness. "Building things that don't matter," Richard replied. "But now I'm here. If you let me, I'll be here for everything. For the early mornings, for the scares, for the doctor's appointments, for when they leave the hospital. Forever." Isabel closed her eyes for a moment. "They are so small, Richard, so fragile." "I know, I saw them. It's going to be difficult. Maybe months in the hospital, maybe complications. It's not like having normal babies." "I know. And I don't know if I can trust you again." The statement hit him like a bullet, but Richard received it without trying to defend himself. "I know I don't deserve your trust, but give me a chance to earn it back." Dr. Dawson entered at that moment to do the morning evaluation. He explained that Isabel was recovering well, but would need to remain hospitalized for at least 3 more days for monitoring. The babies, in turn, would likely remain in the neonatal ICU for at least 6 weeks, perhaps longer, depending on how they responded to treatment. 6 weeks, Richard repeated, trying to mentally calculate what that would mean for his schedule. Then he realized it didn't matter. For the first time in his adult life, his schedule would have to adapt to reality, not the other way around. "Mr. Montgomery," Dr. Dawson said, "may I suggest that you two talk about the next steps? Having premature triplets is a long and demanding journey. You will need to be aligned." After the doctor left, Richard and Isabel remained silent for a few minutes. It was a different silence from those they had shared in the last months of their marriage. It wasn't hostile or evasive, but contemplative, as if both were trying to map the unknown territory that lay ahead. "They don't have names yet," Isabel said finally. "You didn't choose." "I was waiting." She paused, and Richard understood that she had been waiting for him, even after everything. "Can we choose together?" Isabel nodded slowly. "The doctor said they can't be discharged weighing less than 2 kilos each, and they have to be able to feed on their own, without a tube." "How long could that take?" 2, 3 months. Maybe more. 2 or 3 months. Richard made quick calculations, cancelled meetings, postponed contracts, unscheduled trips. Then he realized he was doing exactly what he had done the first time, prioritizing business even subconsciously. "It doesn't matter how long it takes," he said, more to himself than to her. "We will be here." For the first time since she had woken up, Isabel almost smiled. "We? If you let me. If you give me a chance to be the father they deserve, the husband you deserve." "Richard, I don't know if what we had can be recovered." "Then let's start from scratch. Like 2 people who met in the hospital and are learning to be parents together." Isabel considered the proposal. It was, in a way, exactly that. The man sitting beside her bed with red eyes and a crumpled suit was different from the cold businessman who had rejected the idea of having a child. There was a vulnerability in him that she had never seen, a humility that contrasted brutally with the arrogance that had destroyed their marriage. "All right," she said finally, "but I want to make it clear, I'm doing this for the boys, not for us. They deserve to have a present father." "I understand. And if you give up again, if you decide your career is more important, I won't give you a 3rd chance." "You won't need to. I won't give up." That afternoon they went together to see the babies for the first time as parents. Isabel was taken in a wheelchair, still too weak to walk long distances. When she saw her 3 sons consciously for the first time, she broke down in tears. "They are so small," she whispered, reaching out to touch the middle baby through the incubator opening. "But look at their strength," Richard said. "Breathing, fighting. They are warriors like their mother." They spent 2 hours there, alternating between the 3 babies, delicately touching their hands, talking to them in soft murmurs. The nurses explained the basic care, medication schedules, and signs they should observe. "We need names for the birth certificate," one of the nurses said. Richard and Isabel exchanged glances. It was a solemn, almost sacred moment. They were officially naming 3 lives that had come into the world against all odds. "I thought of names that mean strength," Isabel said hesitantly. "Gabriel for the middle one. It means God's strength." Richard nodded. "Gabriel is perfect." "Michael for the biggest," she continued. "It means who is like God." "And the smallest?" Isabel looked at Richard, offering him the chance to choose. He approached Baby A's incubator, the smallest of the 3, the one who had held his finger on the first visit. "Richard," he said simply, "like his father, who is learning to be a man." Isabel smiled for the first time in months. Richard Jr. And so, in a neonatal ICU full of machines and hope, not just a family was born, but a new Richard Montgomery, a man who was discovering that the only projects truly worth it were those that could not be measured in square feet or stock. Market quotes. The Triplets hospital discharge came on a sunny Tuesday in October, 2.5 months after their birth. Michael weighed 2 kilos, 400 grams, Gabriel 2 kilos, 200, and Richard Jr., the eternal fighter, had reached 2 kilos, 100 grams. These were numbers Richard had memorized as if they were stock market quotes, celebrating every gram gained as a personal victory. Dr. Dawson met with them one last time before discharge, a thick folder full of instructions, prescriptions, and emergency numbers. "You'll miss the security of the hospital," he said, noticing the barely disguised anxiety on Richard and Isabel's faces. "It's normal, but you are prepared, more prepared than most parents who leave here." Richard nodded, trying to absorb the doctor's confidence. In recent weeks, he had become an expert at interpreting breathing patterns, recognizing signs of digestive discomfort, and administering medications with millimeter precision. Isabel, with her nursing experience, was even more technically prepared. But both knew that caring for 3 premature babies at home would be completely different from visiting them in a controlled hospital environment. "The house is ready," Richard said, more to reassure himself than to inform the doctor. He had personally supervised the installation of breathing monitors in each crib, the preparation of a nursery that resembled a mini neonatal ICU, and the hiring of 2 specialized neonatal nurses. Lucy would work from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., and Carla would take the night shift. "And you two?" Dr. Dawson asked. "How are things between you?" It was a question Richard and Isabel had avoided answering directly, even between themselves. In recent weeks, they had developed an efficient partnership in caring for the babies, but the status of their relationship remained in undefined and delicate territory. "We're fine," Isabel replied diplomatically. "Focused on the children." Dr. Dawson nodded, but Richard noticed that the doctor had perceived the evasion. "Triplets can put enormous pressure on any relationship. Don't be afraid to ask for help if you need it. And I'm not just talking about medical help. The process of taking 3 babies home from the hospital proved logistically complex in a way Richard hadn't anticipated. 3 strollers, 3 car seats, 3 bags with medical supplies, formulas, medications, and an intimidating amount of diapers and tiny clothes. Richard had rented a spacious SUV specifically for transport, installing the car seats with the care of an aeronautical engineer. Throughout the journey to the house in Surrey Hills, he drove at 12 miles per hour, stopping at every yellow light and taking turns as if carrying crystal. "Richard, you can drive a little faster," Isabel said, amused despite her own anxiety. "They won't break." "You can't be sure of that," he replied, checking the rearview mirror for the 10th time in 5 minutes. The house in Surrey Hills had been transformed. Richard had hired designers specializing in children's environments to create safe and functional spaces. The baby's room was on the ground floor with 3 cribs arranged in a triangular shape for easy access. An adjacent kitchen had been equipped with sterilizers, bottle warmers, and everything needed to prepare special formulas. Lucy, the day shift nurse, greeted them at the door. She was a middle-aged woman, experienced and confident. Her movements were so natural that they immediately reassured Richard and Isabel. First, Let's put them in their cribs to get used to the new environment, she said. Then we'll review feeding and medication routines. The first few hours at home were a mix of relief and panic. It was wonderful to see the babies out of the ICU without wires and machines. But every whimper, every change in breathing, every restlessness triggered internal alarms. "It's normal," Lucy reassured them when she found them leaning over Richard Jr.'s crib for the 4th time. "You've spent months associating machines with their safety. It will take time to trust that they are fine." In the first week, Richard worked from home, but it was impossible to pay attention to international calls when one of the babies cried. Marcus showed up for an urgent meeting and found him rocking Michael while trying to review contracts. "This is unsustainable," Marcus said. "You can't run a multi-million-pound company with babies crying on video calls." "Why not?" Richard replied. "The biggest deals in the world are closed in noisy restaurants, golf courses and nightclubs. At least here the noise is honest." Marcus sighed. "How about we promote Sarah to executive vice president? She takes over most of the operations. You stick to strategic decisions." Richard accepted without hesitation. Before, he would have spent hours analyzing the decision. Now Michael burping properly seemed more urgent. Isabel observed his changes with admiration and caution. It was beautiful to see. Richard reorganizing priorities, but she wondered if it was sustainable or just a phase driven by guilt and novelty. The first big test came when Richard Jr. had a fever, mild, but enough to cause panic. Lucy was out. Carla wouldn't arrive for another 2 hours. They needed to decide whether to go to the hospital. 38.2, Isabel said, looking at the thermometer. Dr. Dawson said to call if it went over 38. "Then let's call," Richard said, already reaching for his phone. "Wait, maybe we should wait 15 minutes and measure again." He took a deep breath and agreed. The 15 minutes felt like an eternity, but the temperature dropped to 37.8. "How did you know it was better to wait?" he asked. "Experience," Isabel replied. He was breathing well, had no other signs of discomfort. Richard felt a wave of gratitude, and soon after, fear of what would happen if she decided not to stay. "Isa, I can't do this without you." She looked at him. "Do what?" "Everything. Raising 3 children, making important decisions, being a good father. I thought I could control everything with money and planning, but this requires wisdom I don't have." "You're learning," she said softly. "It's not enough. I need you, not just because you're their mother, but because you make me a better person." Isabel remained silent. Before she could respond, the 3 babies woke up crying, interrupting the conversation. 2 weeks later, on a chaotic night when all 3 had digestive problems at the same time, and Carla was absent, Richard and Isabel spent exhausted hours, operating at their limit. At 4 in the morning, Isabel laughed at a comment he made. The first genuine laugh in months. Something opened up there. They talked, remembered. The past, laughed, shared tasks, touched hands almost unintentionally. And something changed. Later, Richard asked, "Would you consider giving us a second chance?" Isabel took a deep breath. "I've been thinking about it, about what it would mean to try again. And I think maybe loving isn't never making mistakes. Maybe it's learning from mistakes, becoming a better person because of them." "Is that a yes?" I'm willing to try, really. Not just coexist for the children, really try." "I love you," Richard said. "I never stopped loving you, even when I acted like an idiot." "I love you, too," she replied. "Even when I hated you, I still loved you. It's annoying, actually." They laughed. They looked at the cribs, at the mess, at the new, unpredictable, exhausting, and real life. "And now?" Richard asked. "Now we see if we can build something better than before." When Richard Jr. woke up demanding attention, both knew that was their life now. Interrupted conversations, stolen moments, love built in the intervals between bottles and diaper changes. And, for the first time in years, both believed it was worth it. Outside, London awoke to another day of hustle and ambition, but inside that house, another form of success was being defined. measured not in profits but in rebuilt trust, rediscovered love, and the simple miracle of a family learning to be whole. 3 weeks later, the doctors finally authorized the triplets' discharge. Isabel had chosen the names during one of the long afternoons in the NICU: Michael, Richard Jr., and Gabriel. Richard had participated in the discussions, suggesting options, but leaving the final decision to her, a deference that Isabel noticed and appreciated. The apartment Isabel had rented near the hospital was too small for a family of 5, so Richard had rented a spacious house in a gated community in the Surrey Hills. There were 3 bedrooms for the children, an office that could be converted into a studio for Isabel, and a garden where they could play when they grew up. "It's temporary," he explained when he showed the house to Isabel, "until we decide where we want to live permanently, if you even want me to be part of that decision." Isabel walked through the spacious rooms, observing how Richard had thought of every detail. The children's room had 3 identical cribs, changing tables, a comfortable armchair for breastfeeding. There were baby monitors, sterilizers, a complete pharmacy of children's medications. "You really did your homework," she said, inspecting the pantry full of formulas and diapers. "I read 4 books about premature triplets," Richard admitted, "and I talked to 2 families who went through the same situation. I wanted to be prepared." It was this attention to detail, this silent dedication, that was slowly lowering Isabel's defenses. During the month at the hospital, she had watched Richard transform from a controlling businessman into a dedicated father. She had seen how he memorized each baby's medication schedule, how he learned to recognize the different types of crying, how he managed to calm Michael when he was agitated, or make Richard Jr. fall asleep by singing softly. The first few months at home tested every limit they imagined having. Triplets meant that when one woke up to feed, the other 2 soon followed. It meant 3 different medication schedules, 3 distinct sleep patterns, 3 personalities already clearly emerging. Michael was the contemplative one, who observed everything with serious eyes before deciding whether to cry or smile. Richard Jr. was the determined one, who protested loudly against anything he didn't say approve of. Gabriel was the sociable one, always seeking eye contact and responding to voices with satisfied gurgles. Richard had taken an indefinite leave from business, leaving the operation of the resorts in the hands of his team. During the day, he and Isabel took turns caring for the children. During the night, they woke up together for feedings, working in silent synchronicity developed through weeks of practice. "You don't have to do this," Isabel said one early morning, when she found Richard changing Richard Jr.'s diaper at 2:30 a.m. "I can handle it alone. I know you can." He replied, putting Richard Jr. back in his crib. "But I don't want you to have to handle it alone, not anymore." It was these small moments that were rebuilding the trust between them. Richard didn't make grand declarations or dramatic promises. He simply showed up consistently for every night feeding, every doctor's appointment, every moment of stress and exhaustion. After 2 months, Isabel made a decision. "I want you to move in here," she said one afternoon, while the children napped. "Officially as a family." Richard, who was organizing clean clothes, stopped moving. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure I want to try. I don't promise it will be easy or that we won't fight, but I want my children to grow up with their father present. And I want to see if we can be happy together." "What about what happened before?" Isabel approached him, taking his hands. "That will always be part of our story. You ran away when I needed you most, and I'll need time to trust you completely again. But I also see who you've become. I see the man who wakes up at 3 in the morning singing to Richard Jr. when he can't sleep. I see the father who reads stories to Gabriel even knowing he doesn't understand a word." She paused, searching for the right words. "I see someone who made a terrible mistake and is working every day to fix it. And that gives me hope." That night, Richard slept in the master bedroom for the first time since they had moved into the house. It wasn't immediately romantic. Both were too exhausted for anything but sleep. But it was a beginning. In the following weeks, they slowly rebuilt intimacy. Long conversations after the children were asleep. Simple. Dinners when they managed to synchronize the 3 children's sleep schedules. Small gestures of affection that gradually grew into something bigger. Richard gradually returned to work, but in a completely different way. Instead of constant travel, he managed the resorts remotely. Instead of 12-hour days, he worked while the children slept. He had hired a full-time assistant for operational matters and focused only on the most important strategic decisions. "Don't you miss it?" Isabel asked one day, watching him refuse an international meeting because it coincided with the triplets' first birthday. "The business adrenaline? Sometimes," he admitted. "But I don't miss the loneliness. I don't miss waking up without purpose. I don't miss building things that mean nothing but money." On the children's first birthday, they had a small party in the garden of the house, just family and a few close friends. Richard watched Michael trying to eat cake with his hands, Richard Jr. happily destroying wrapping paper, Gabriel laughing at the antics of his grandfather, who had come from Brighton for the occasion. "They're huge," Isabel said, sitting next to him on the veranda as they watched the children play on the grass. "And perfect," Richard added. "Sometimes I still can't believe they're ours." "Do you regret it?" Isabel asked, "changing your life so drastically?" Richard turned to look at her. She had gained a few pounds due to sleepless nights and irregular meal times. She had permanent dark circles under her eyes and wore practical clothes instead of the elegant dresses she used to prefer. And yet, she was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. "I regret not changing sooner," he said, "wasting so much time being afraid to live." That night, after the children were asleep and the last guests had left, Richard took a small velvet box he had hidden in the dresser drawer. "Isabel," he said, kneeling in the living room full of scattered toys, "I know I'm not the same man you met in Cornwall. I know I'm still learning to be a father, to be a partner, to be present. But I also know that I want to learn these things with you forever." Isabel covered her mouth with her hands, her eyes filling with tears. "I'm not asking you to forget what happened between us. I'm asking you to believe that we can build something new on the lessons we've learned. Will you marry me? Not because we have children together, but because I choose you every day as the person I want to live this messy and beautiful life we've built with." The ring was simple, a small but perfect solitaire, very different from the excesses he would have chosen in the past. "Yes," Isabel said, allowing him to place the ring on her finger. "Yes, I want to marry you." They married 6 months later, in the garden of the same house where they had learned to be a family. The ceremony was intimate, only close relatives and dear friends. Isabel wore a simple cream silk dress that allowed movement to run after the children if necessary. Richard wore a navy blue suit he had bought especially for the occasion. Michael, Richard Jr., and Gabriel, now a year and a half old, were the official page boys and flower girl, Richard Jr. as the flower boy, wearing coordinated outfits that lasted exactly the time of the photos before getting dirty with grass and cake. Richard's grandfather, now 85, came from Brighton for the ceremony. After the photos, he pulled his grandson aside to a corner of the garden. "Do you remember what I taught you about hospitality?" the elder asked. "That it's about making people feel at home." "Exactly, and you finally learned that applies to your own family too." Richard looked around the garden, where Isabel laughed as she tried to stop Gabriel from eating flowers, where Richard Jr. bravely explored every corner of the space, where Michael observed everything with the serious curiosity that was his trademark. "It took me too long to learn," Richard admitted. "But you learned," the grandfather said, patting his shoulder, "and now you have a lifetime to practice." 2. Years later, they moved to a larger house on the Dorset coast, 2 hours away from both the capital and Brighton. Richard had sold half of his resorts to focus on smaller, more meaningful projects. Isabel had opened a residential design office that quickly gained recognition for creating homes that truly worked for families. The new house had a sea view, a huge garden where the children could run freely, and a spacious studio where Isabel worked while the little ones played nearby. Richard had installed an office in the attic but rarely used it. He preferred to work at the kitchen table, where he could supervise his children's mischief while taking calls. Michael had become the organizer of the trio, always aligning his toys and trying to teach order to his brothers. Richard Jr. was the adventurer, climbing everything he found and handling scratches and falls as welcome battles. Gabriel was the diplomat, always mediating conflicts between his brothers and winning over adults with his irresistible smile. On a Sunday afternoon, Richard was on the veranda assembling a playhouse with Michael, when Isabel sat beside them, watching Richard Jr. teach Gabriel to whistle in the garden. "Are you happy?" she asked, as she did periodically. "Ridiculously happy," Richard replied without hesitation. "And you?" "Sometimes I wonder what it would be like if you hadn't run away at the beginning, if we would have gotten here by a more direct path." Richard stopped screwing in the miniature window and looked at her. "Do you regret giving me a second chance?" "Never," Isabel said. "But sometimes I wonder if you needed to run away to learn to value what you had." "Maybe," Richard admitted. "Maybe I was too emotionally young to understand what you represented. Maybe I needed to lose you to discover what kind of man I wanted to be." "And what kind of man did you want to be?" Richard looked at Michael, who was focused on fitting a tiny door into place. He looked at Richard Jr., who was patiently demonstrating the whistling technique to Gabriel for the 10th time. He looked at Isabel, with her hair tied in a messy bun and blue paint on her little finger from a creative afternoon with the children. "A man who builds homes," he said. "Not hotels, not businesses. Homes. Places where people feel safe to be who they really are." "And did you succeed?" Richard leaned in to kiss her, a brief kiss but full of certainty. "I did. With you." That night, after the children were asleep, they sat on the veranda with a bottle of wine and a pile of architectural plans. Richard had started working on a new project, a series of small family guest houses scattered along the British coast, each designed to welcome families seeking genuine connection. "This will be our legacy," he said, pointing to the drawings. "Not financial empires or architectural awards, places where other families can create memories like the ones we're creating." Isabel smiled, remembering the rigid, controlling man she had met in Cornwall. Little of him remained in the present father and attentive husband who now shared her life. "You've changed so much," she said. "We've changed," Richard corrected. "You taught me that building isn't about controlling. It's about creating spaces where life can flourish." From the children's room came the familiar sound of Gabriel waking up for a late-night feeding. Automatically, both got up to attend to him. A synchronized dance developed through 3 years of shared nights. "My turn," Isabel said, but Richard was already walking towards the room. "Our turn," he said, as he always did. As they warmed the bottle together in the quiet kitchen, Richard reflected on how he had gotten there. From a man who measured success in spreadsheets to someone who considered a full night's sleep a rare and unnecessary luxury. From someone who avoided emotional complications to a person who consciously chose the loving chaos of a large family. "No regrets?" Isabel asked, as if she could read his thoughts. "Only one," Richard said, picking up Gabriel and sitting in the feeding armchair, "that I can't go back in time and live all this from day one." Gabriel snuggled against his father's chest, tiny fingers closing around Richard's index finger. It was a scene that had been repeated almost every night for 3 years, but which still managed to move Richard to tears. "You're a good father," Isabel said, sitting on the arm of the armchair, "and a good man." "I'm a man who was lucky enough to find someone willing to teach me how to love," Richard replied, "and willing to forgive me when I learned wrong the first time." When Gabriel fell back asleep and they returned to bed, Richard hugged Isabel and felt the deep gratitude that had become his predominant emotion. Not for wealth, professional success, or any material achievement. Gratitude for the second chance. For the noisy, messy family they had built. For the extraordinary woman who had chosen to rebuild a life beside him. "I love you," he whispered in the darkness. "I love you too," Isabel replied. "All of us love you." And as they fell asleep, embraced, with the sound of the sea in the distance and the soft breathing of 3 children in the next room, Richard knew he had finally found what truly mattered. It wasn't control, it wasn't predictability, it wasn't achievements that could be measured in numbers. It was love. It was family. It was the courage to build something imperfect and real, day after day, with the right people by his side. It was the life he had almost lost out of fear, and which he now embraced with all the intensity of a man who had learned that the best projects don't follow architectural plans. They follow the heart.